Greetings, quilters. We quilt just to have fun and to give the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren something homemade. We hope they will feel loved as well as feel a family connection. We've always wanted to make a kaleidoscope quilt, and while looking for ideas, we saw this quilt by Shabby Fabrics and wanted to make one like it. Jen has quilt kits available at her website. We made this quilt first and decided to make another one. This is the second one that we made. Our first line of business was to design a quilt using our EQ8 program. We know that with a kaleidoscope quilt, the bill of materials would not be exact because of the selective use of the fabric pattern, but it gave us a starting place. We found this fabric online. The center of the fabric has a big crease from being folded on the bolt. We have to use this part of the pattern for our project, so it will have to be pressed. The pattern of this print leaves a lot of the fabric without any print ink to stabilize the fabric. Most of the cuts will be on the bias, which can distort very easily. We usually use starch to stabilize and keep the fabric from distorting. When we sprayed starch on the fabric, it began to shrink. When the starch dried, the fabric shrank even more. We have not tested to see if the fabric will shrink evenly over the entire length of the fabric when starched. We think that ironing with a little steam, ironing in the direction of the warp thread, and using a light touch with the iron is the best ironing technique. Likewise, when sewing, it is important to not pull the fabric. Most fabric is printed on a continuous press using a cylinder to apply the ink. To find the repeat of this pattern, check the edge of the fabric. It usually has some markings. Find a mark and look along the edge of the fabric until you find the same mark again. This is the repeat of the pattern. You can also measure the distance from a design feature to where it repeats again. Be sure that the feature is the same distance from the edge of the fabric. The repeat can be from 12 to 28 inches, give or take. The repeat for our fabric is 24 3/8 inches. This fabric has 5 stripes with a pattern that looks the same for each stripe. To verify that they are all the same requires cutting about a 1-inch strip through the design. Use this strip to check each stripe. We are planning to use the full size of the template, and by cutting paper templates, you can see that we can get 5 triangles from each pattern repeat. Cutting 4 triangles instead of 5 will give us the flexibility of creating different patterns for each quilt block. We cut across the width of the fabric at each repeat. For this fabric, it is 23 3/8 inches. We then cut each of the 5 stripes. We need 8 layers of the exact same pattern to make the octagon block. I strongly suggest reviewing Jordan Fabric's Kaleidoscope tutorial. Matt Jordan gives an excellent presentation on pinning and cutting fabric. The fabric used in this presentation is completely printed, providing more stabilization to the fabric. You can see how exactly the pattern matches each layer and how exact his cutting is. We selected an easy-to-identify spot and put a pin through each layer of fabric. We align the fabric with the cutting mat and align the center of the template to the cutting mat. This helps keep everything aligned. Check for pins before cutting. We didn't find the rotating mat that helpful and reverted back to just using the cutting mat. After making the first cut, hold the template securely. Move the ruler next to the template. Securely hold the ruler, remove the template, and make the cut using the ruler as the guide. We rotate the template 180 degrees and continue cutting. When all of the triangle pieces are cut, we can begin sewing. We sew two pieces together. Make sure to align the patterns. In this case, we align the straight pattern of both sides and then sew two more pieces together until all 8 pieces are sewn together in pairs. We planned to sew the blocks together using Y-seams, but that proved to not be a good idea. So just sew the seams all the way without marking or backstitching. Finger press all the seams in the same direction together by aligning them and start sewing at the current seam. Make sure to anchor the start of this seam. Be sure to match the patterns of both triangles as you sew this seam. Sewing the two halves together, align the seam centers of the top layer with the seam center of the bottom layer. Using a pin to do this will yield the best results. We start sewing at the center and sew the first half, then flip the piece over and start sewing from the center, overlapping the seam, and sew the other half. Always check and align the pattern of both sides before sewing. The ears at the center of the block will fold flat if you started sewing at the seam when you sewed the pairs together. We press the seams on the underside first, and then press the face side of the block. This quilt requires 8 partial blocks. We cut blocks the width of the triangle base. These blocks will be used to join the quilt blocks together. The next step is to lay out the quilt blocks and arrange them the way we want them to look and add the connecting white blocks. We sew the blocks of each row together with the white blocks, and yes, these are Y-seams. We sew all of the rows together. And yes, all of these seams are Y-seams. The quilt top is sewn together. We cut the quilt top edges and we sewed the border on, and the quilt top is finished. I was very unhappy with the results of the quilt at this time and just left it for a couple of weeks before coming back to it. I asked my wife if it was good enough to finish, and she said yes. So we finished it. I wanted to try this again without using Y-seams. The difference was adding corner pieces to 4 of the 8 triangles. We do this by measuring the width of the triangle base, which is 7 inches. We then cut enough 7-inch strips to make 120 triangles. Then cut 7-inch blocks from the strips, and then cut the blocks diagonally both ways to make the 120 triangles. We sewed these white triangles to 4 triangles for each block, ironed them, arranged the quilt block, and sewed the block together. We cut each block to the same size. We planned to make this quilt on point, the same as the first quilt, but I didn't lay the quilt blocks out, and in a hurry, I cut 5 blocks in half. They should have been cut diagonally. Instead of remaking the 5 blocks, we modified the design. We selected border material and finished sewing the quilt top. This is the finished quilt top. We thumbtack the 4 sides of the quilt back with 1 thumbtack to keep it in place. The fabric has to be face down on the quilting frame. Next, we spread the batting on the quilt back and smooth it flat. We add the quilt top and gently pull and thumbtack everything even to avoid wrinkles in any of the 3 layers. We pin the 3 layers together with quilter's safety pins, spaced about 4 to 6 inches apart. When the quilt is pinned, we removed it from the quilting frame. We sewed the borders using the stitch in the ditch method. We then sewed stitch in the ditch from one side of the quilt to the other side, then from one end of the quilt to the other end, until all quilt blocks are sewn all around. To sew each triangle, we sewed from one side to the other side and back to the starting point. See the arrows marked on the tape. Do the same thing for the other triangles. With the exception of the borders, the top is quilted. We quilted triangles in the borders after completing the binding. We trimmed the quilt to size. It is starting to look like a quilt. We squared the corners. We cut the binding to 2.5 inches and sewed it together. Binding is cut on the bias. We fold the binding in half and iron it. We like to pin the binding to the top of the quilt. We sew the binding to the top of the quilt. We pull the binding to the back side of the quilt and stitch it with a hem stitch. This quilt is finished and is okay, but I wish that I hadn't cut the end blocks the wrong way. I like the on-point look of the other quilt much better, but this is okay. This is the first quilt with the on-point layout, and I really like the arrangement of the blocks better on this quilt. Even though I was disappointed in me and how the quilts turned out, I think what I have learned in the process was well worth the effort. We hope that you have enjoyed this presentation and possibly picked up a few thoughts for your next quilt. Thank you for taking your time to watch our presentation.